You're listening to the MindPod Network. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by the Timothy Leary Project, Inside the Great Counterculture Experiment, a new book written by Jennifer Ulrich and published by Abrams Books, available wherever books are sold. It's all happening. 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 Welcome to the podcast. Is the music done yet? Has it faded out? Yes, it has. Episode 114 of the It's All Happening with Zach Leary podcast. That's me, your host. I'm so happy that you're here. This week on the podcast, I should actually change that intro just a little bit and say, well, welcome to the Maps podcast as well. The other podcast that I host. In this specific instance, for this episode, I'm double dipping a little bit. This week's guest on the Maps podcast is Duncan Trussell, and we recorded an original episode of the podcast, of the Maps podcast, with Duncan at his place in Silver Lake. But as usual with Duncan, it was just so good that I thought, well, why not use it for the It's All Happening podcast as well? It's not necessarily out of laziness. Maybe it is just a little bit, but it's such a good interview. Why not expose it to more people? And also, of course, there's the objective of exposing the Maps podcast to more people as well. If you're not familiar with the other podcast that I host for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, you are now. And so I'm just so thrilled that Duncan did it. And we kept the conversation very specific in its nature and its topical application, and that it's pretty much just about psychedelics. But we'll get into that in a second. But first, a word from our sponsor. The Timothy Leary Project, Inside the Great Counterculture Experiment, by Jennifer Ulrich, published by Abrams Books. First and foremost, Timothy Leary was a psychologist dedicated to exploring the workings of the mind. As scholars of psychology, Leary and his colleague Richard Alpert approached the study of the human mind and behavior by applying standard scientific methods from the field of social sciences. As professors in the Department of Social Relations at Harvard University, they were tasked with the usual duties of advising graduate students applying for grants and conducting research under the support of Harvard's Center for Research in Personality. At the time, Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner's theories in behaviorism dominated the department. His models entailed the idea of stimulus response, conditioning, and reinforcement in shaping human behavior. That is a short excerpt from the Timothy Leary Project. This book is really based on the vast collection of letters and other papers that make up the Timothy Leary archives, which are now held at the New York Public Library. Stored in 600 boxes, this material has been largely left untouched and unpublished until now. Thanks to the work of archivist and debut author Jennifer Ulrich, readers will have a chance to explore the life of Timothy Leary like never before. Ulrich organizes the rich material into an annotated narrative of Leary's adventure life, an epic quest for spiritual discovery that had a lasting impact on American culture. The book is out now and is available wherever books are sold, online or in person. Get your copy today. So thank you to Abrams Books for sponsoring this episode of the It's All Happening podcast. I am very grateful for that. And yeah, in all seriousness, the commercial aside, this book is pretty terrific and is a peek into Timothy's work that has not been available before. So I hope you take a moment to check it out. So before we get into the podcast with Duncan, I did want to take a moment to recognize John Perry Barlow, who transitioned into the next dimension of existence since the last episode of the podcast. He passed away in mid-February. In case you don't know who John Perry Barlow was, he was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, primarily wrote songs with Bob Weir and Brent Midland, and he was also the co-founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and was highly instrumental in shaping human rights as they exist in cyberspace today. So instead of letting the internet get taken over by giant corporations, yes, that's starting to happen now. But Barlow was, like I said, very instrumental in the early days of keeping the internet free, egalitarian, and powerful for every single person on the planet. Barlow had a tremendous effect on my life because, well, when I knew him, he was very good friends with my parents, and he also wrote some of my favorite Grateful Dead songs, which is massive for me. So I met Barlow when I was 14 years old, and then I was just a gangly, confused teenager trying to find my way in the world. But during the span of these 30 years, my relationship with Barlow, we're in and out. Sometimes we're in each other's orbits very frequently and fondly, maybe sharing a laugh at one of his trademark Barlow frenzies. Sometimes years could go by, sometimes even awkwardly, but they would always resolve in an affectionate and loving reunion somewhere around the world. It must be said that certain elements of my time with Barlow could contain their fair of complex tensions having to do with the very strong personalities of both my families and his being. That's not to say any of it had an lasting effect. They were gradually balanced out with countless intimate moments of dancing in each other's consciousness that could only be achieved by Barlow's brilliance at understanding complex ecosystems and then knowing how to rebuild them. I say this with the utmost conviction and gratitude. I'd be a very different person than I am today had I never crossed paths with John Perry Barlow. Shine on. I'll miss you. Lazy Lightning by John Perry Barlow and Bob Weir. This week on the podcast, Duncan Trussell, who really did an episode of the MAPS podcast. So here it is, an episode of the MAPS podcast with Duncan Trussell. This is episode 114 of the It's All Happening podcast and episode 26 of the MAPS podcast. Of course, you know who Duncan Trussell is. Comedian, stand-up comedian, podcaster of the highly influential Duncan Trussell Family Hour, and he was gracious enough to give his time and energy to doing the MAPS podcast. So here you go. Dig it. Good.
We're rolling.
Duncan, welcome to the MAPS podcast.
Thanks for having me, Zach.
Thank you so much for doing it and for hosting and for facilitating. Great to see you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, man. So this is like episode 26 of the MAPS podcast, and only about half of them, a little bit less than half of them, have been originals. We're usually sourcing the archives of great previous lectures and psychedelic science kind of stuff and reframing it. But I was excited to do this one with you, and being a cultural observer and a psychedelicist in your own right, and I think you are a great living example of the promise of psychedelics.
Thank you.
Sure. But, you know, I am very curious as to your take. There's no question, no matter what side you're on, we're living in a complicated world.
That's correct.
Crazy things are happening, right?
Yes.
don't have to dissect that. But, being in the psychedelic frame of mind and taking note of what psychedelics has done for your consciousness and for your own personal evolution, for your own place in the world, how does it affect your relationship with the outside world? How do you see our place in the world right now through the psychedelic lens?
Okay, so, it's a process. So I guess maybe it goes without saying, but whatever I'm saying right now is just sort of part of this process that happens with psychedelics. So psychedelics have produced in me a series of epiphanies and realizations that have been transformative and destructive in the sense that they've annihilated the self that I thought I was, and
all at the same time.
Yes.
Right.
And I guess destruction is
Shiva.
I guess destruction and transformation are actually pretty much the same thing. But what I'm saying is, so this is kind of where I'm at right now. Where we think about the outside world or the reality that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
And I see it as a frame of experience that is extended for a pretty long time, 60 years, 80 years. We're in this frame for about 80 years where all around us is this stuff. And the stuff is appearing and then disintegrating, and we get very attached to the stuff. But I think what we're in right now fades out, and then we continue to experience the observing self. It's non-different than what Ram Dass talks about. It's just through psychedelics, I feel like I have a deeper grasp on the simultaneous impermanence of this reality and what appears to be a non-ending sentience.
So is that sort of like when you die, consciousness does not cease to exist?
No way.
Right.
I don't think so at all.
I don't think so either.
And I think this is a frame that we're in. And it's like, my friend put it like, it's like a viewfinder, when you're clicking the side. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what this is. It's like a frame in the viewfinder that we're looking through, and it's a wonderful frame,
right.
But it's definitely a frame that is going to click out, and that's really shocking to people and astounding because they get confused. Again, I know none of this is new data. It's like just subjectively, it's become more clear to me through psychedelics.
Well, the importance of this data and why I asked the question has to do with integration, because as I see it, I mean, it's not exactly this simple, but to oversimplify it, one of the problems with the 1960s and so many people turning on so quickly without any historical context, there was no data.
Yeah.
There's no background. People were just turning on, was that they had no bedrock of integration. So these millions of kids didn't know what to do with it afterwards. So then they kind of got confused, and then they just slipped back into the yuppie mainstream, and that's what happened. These days, we have a lot of context. We have a lot of data. We have a lot of reference points. So do you think that kind of there could be a mass proliferation of psychedelics that would help us? Do you think it would help if more people consciously turned on?
Yeah. And there is a mass proliferation of psychedelics.
Yeah. Well, okay. I think there is, but I also get often confused because then we look around at some of the bigger problems of what's happening in this country, and you're like, well, if there is, why isn't that being fixed?
Well, that's the stage. We're all looking at the stage, and that's the show that they call popular culture, and that's the reality tunnel that we're all invited to hang out in. And what's really interesting about the show is that it's so fucking absorbing, and it's so infinitely fascinating, and there's so many, it's a fractal. The show is a fractal. Like, you can get, can, it's like being at this incredible, it's like being an amazing, amazing show, and being able to zoom in to just tiny, tiny little set decorations, maybe a glass on a table, and then zoom in on that glass and then know where the glass was made and who made the glass, and then discover that the maker of the fucking glass made the glass in a goddamn concentration camp in North Korea. This is fucking slave glass, man. And then you can go deeper into that. And so it's an amazing show. And it's infinitely
Chaos
interesting.
theory in action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what happens is we begin to think that's the only show. And many people do. They don't understand that outside of the theater, there is all of these other things that are happening. There are all these beautiful things that are happening that are not just, I'm not talking about secret cabals of people or secret groups.
The New World Order, man.
Yeah, I don't
Yes.
just mean the dark version of that. I mean, there's a light version of that happening too, but I don't just mean that in the grand scale. I mean that for sure what's happening is psychedelic communities are forming, continue to form every day, groups of people who have psychedelic sacraments that they use to expand their own subjective consciousness so that they can more fully blend with the collective, and through that blending create art that they can then secretly or not so secretly bring out onto the stage that the people who are in popular culture can ogle and marvel at and be astounded by and wonder what it was and what is that and what does that mean and who made that thing, man? And I think that's just a fun game.
Yes.
So it has proliferated. It's, I think, one of the beauties of the fact that what you're saying is, what if the state became less restrictive on the use of the psychedelics?
Less restrictive, and I'm looking to sort of bust the us and them paradigm, because what we're seeing, aside from, and you did a great job of expressing sort of the multiverse in our current reality.
Yeah.
There are many different realities going on.
Yeah.
There's no question about it, but they are incredibly divisive. How do we sort of just erode at that divisiveness a little bit? And the 60s had a really strong us and them construct to it.
Yeah.
I mean, that was part of it. Like, fuck the man, and it's like us versus them, hippies versus squares, our parents versus the kids. It's very, very, strongly divided. And to some extent, I get that, why it makes sense intellectually and why it makes sense, like, when we talk about Krishna consciousness, good association, things like that. But on the other hand, I'm trying to just find how can the promise of psychedelic therapy, perhaps, and this is why I love what MAPS is doing. Yeah. Because introducing it into the therapeutic
it's amazing.
system.
It's amazing.
Gets you to an audience that is not at Burning Man.
Yeah, it's true.
Right.
I mean, that's Doblin. That's when you see Rick, you see a man who is sort of the I guess you could say I think Doblin doesn't think that he's the only one at MAPS, but he's kind of their spokesperson in a lot of ways. That's who we think of. Mm-hmm. And whenever I see Doblin, what I see is a man who deeply loves people. And I can remember, he did this thing. I bet he won't even remember this. It was after a show, and a group of us were walking around. It was in New York. He just magically showed up at this panel that we did on microdosing, and it's always cool when he's around. And so, but then everyone's getting to the point of the night where we're all going to say goodbye. It's drizzling a little bit, and I'd called an Uber, and I'm waiting, and I'm with this group, and I'm like, all right, see you guys later. And Rick was like, I think I want to wait until the Uber picks you up, because he wanted to make sure I'd be okay. Yes. And it was such a sweet. He didn't know he was doing that, but it was just like, man, that's a real cool thing to do. Yeah. Because I know I'm going to be. It's New York, but it was just that. So I think that's on a small scale. That's what Rick's like with everything, and I think he's taken on this really intense task that we all recognize how monumental it is, because
and how difficult it's been,
and how difficult. And that's what I see when I see Rick. I see a person who's really sacrificed. And for this thing you're talking about, which is to bring it from Burning Man, bring it from the
Grateful Dead parking lot,
or just the little parties and the little communities and all the beautiful, vibrant, pixels of the psychedelic community that have to exist outside of the stage lighting because we'll get arrested, or it's dangerous, or it's not understood. And like the fact that he's like figured out a way to become an emissary for those rooms and spaces, and he's figured out a way to become a translator for those epiphanies, and the language he's translating it into is the language of science and the language of bureaucracy. And to think that that man has managed to do that with such great success that it seems like it's going to be happening is incredibly exciting to me.
It is.
And the reason it's exciting to me really doesn't have much to do with me, because in the sense that, come on, man, if you're living today and you're not, sometimes people will send me an Instagram message just like, do you know where to get mushrooms, man? and of course, like my response is like, no, I don't, man. I don't, officer. I don't know that, man. But really the truth of the matter is, it's like, it's not that difficult for a person to obtain one of these plant medicines or sacraments. So what I'm saying is, it's like, for me personally, having access to a therapy room where I could take MDMA is not going to be my number one means of contacting those chemicals or that medicine. But for a lot of people who would be afraid to go off the map, as you have to do, and as since we've been in high school, you and I have, done that. It's just everyone, a lot of folks aren't going to go off the map. And so suddenly to be able to go into these rooms, therapeutic rooms of healing, where a lot of money and time has been spent perfecting a methodology to amplify the healing nature of these substances. Holy fuck. What is that going to do? We just can't even imagine the effect that's going to have on our society.
Well, I think we can't imagine what kind of effect that's going to have on our society, but I think kind of one really interesting telltale right now, and you just alluded to it, is the legalization of cannabis in California.
Yeah.
When you and I are around the same age, when we were in high school, the procurement of weed, half of it was about not getting busted.
Yeah.
I met this guy in a blue van who we met like at the All-American Burger on Westwood Boulevard or something.
Yeah.
And he was always kind of moving around. It was like this sketchy sort of thing that you had to do to meet him to get the weed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And now that system, that way of relating to turning on is eroded, that changes everything.
It changes everything,
right? So it's really interesting on... I'm kind of being a little hypocritical, saying our side of the fence, not wanting to do the us and them thing, but seeing some of the reaction in the traditional psychedelic community towards the kind of uncomfortable acceptance of bureaucracy that MAPS is pushing. Like, they're really they just took money from the Mercers, right? Like $1 million for the PTSD phase 3.
Who are the Mercers?
The Mercers are a very prominent East Coast pharmaceutical kind of cabal, right-wing, Trump-supporting, hardcore.
Oh,
yes.
No.
Yeah, pretty.
Not the Mercers.
Exactly. Pretty intense stuff to kind of, the thought being, if you take their money, well, there's some kind of strings attached, man.
It's fucking dirty money, man.
You're dancing with the devil.
Mercer money.
They helped get Trump elected.
Fuck.
I disagree, though. I think it's fantastic. I think it's great. Why take money from the other side? Bridge the gap. Have a conversation. Sit at the table.
Yeah, just do. It's just kind of like, okay, man, we're putting out a fire here, all right? And if a Mercer fire truck pulls up and wants to start spraying water on the fire, I'm not going to be like, we don't use Mercer water to put out this fire.
Well, you could even distill it even more specifically than that, and saying the phase 3 PTSD MDMA trials. You could say, well, this is about helping veterans. This is about healing veterans.
Yeah.
So why should liberals only heal veterans through this kind of therapy?
Yeah.
You can make it really, really specific, and that this isn't just about the proliferation of a psychedelic miracle. We can apply it to this is helping veterans with their pain.
And my dad's a veteran, and I want him helped with his pain, and
right.
And I want anyone help with their pain. And I know many people whose parents have PTSD and are veterans, And these people go through, their lives have been a living fucking hell. They've walked in on their dad, with a shotgun in his mouth. This is a daily experience for people out there. So it's like, anybody in my mind who's gotten caught up in that kind of thinking has lost sight of the big picture. And the big picture is that we need to facilitate healing in this world as much as we possibly can while we're here, and whatever allies we find in that, no matter how nefarious they may be in other workings, if they want to engage in this particular working with us, which is to figure out a way to beam in a really specific kind of miracle, which is the miracle of psychedelics, then to resist that or to get all stuffy over that is just, I think there's better things to get stuffy and resistant over than that.
Yes, there are. So the big picture, what do you think is the most promising immediate application of psychedelics into the mainstream?
Okay. But rather than saying the application of psychedelics, what's really exciting to me about the research that MAPS is doing is that we can apply that research personally to, I think this is probably something MAPS is going to have to deal with, which is that people are going to start modeling whatever this particular form of psychedelic therapy is. People personally are going to examine the methodology that they're using in the therapy sessions, the way it's done, and they're going to want to do that privately in their own homes. And
oh, really?
Sure. So? Fuck okay. Yeah. I mean, once that data's out there, it's like, I think they, of course they know, and they're probably a little worried. What we don't want is a bunch of you don't want people posing as, I think one of the things that's a little questionable about the way people are taking ayahuasca right now is that many of the people who are administering the medicine haven't been trained fully enough to sit with people who are in that state of consciousness.
You don't become a shaman in one weekend.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So, and I think that's of all the psychedelics, the one that I've heard the most horror stories about is ayahuasca.
Yes, likewise.
Suicide after taking it, and full on bipolar episodes. Now, of course, the problem is people are taking ayahuasca who have a history of bipolar, and right. you unfortunately, maybe you can't do that. That's not the medicine for you. But my point is that I think a lot of these things that have happened could have easily been prevented if there was some kind of, to say it sounds absurd, but a licensing or some way of knowing this is an actual shaman who's trained like a doctor, because these people train like doctors for years and years and years, who and if you want to sit with one of those people, otherwise you can end up with people who are grabbing your tits and telling you they need to do that to get the spirits out. So it's so in the same way, what this research on MDMA is going to produce, no pun intended, a map for psychedelic therapy that we don't really have right now, a system, a specific dosage, a way that pretty much anybody who wanted to could probably in some way or another in a rudimentary way imitate it.
Right.
And personally, I'm quite excited about that. I'm quite excited about that research because I just think the more we are educated in these other ways or more, I don't want to say sophisticated, but more high-tech ways of working with the medicine.
It changes the story.
Yeah, it changes the story.
It changes the story. I mean, the worried mom who lives in Valencia who doesn't know anything about MDMA, and all of a sudden her kids are doing MDMA and going to raves. The only thing that she's ever heard is she's seen some local Fox or KTLA local news thing about bad ecstasy in kids and freaking out. So her story in her head has been completely programmed to this, and this also has a lot to do with the purity of the actual chemical too. That's very, very important. But it totally destroys that. It's like, oh, okay, all of a sudden here we have this mainstream, data set, therapeutic method that has been disseminated into our culture that can make its way into, I think it starts with parents. That's such a hugely, hugely important, because, the one thing that you always hear about the war on drugs is, what about the children? What about the children, right? So if we can just kind of shift that conversation a little bit and create a new model.
Sure, yeah. As somebody who's really might not breed in this incarnation, I love the children and I want the children to be happy. But also, one of the aspects I love about the time that we're in is that when I was a kid and I wanted to explore what LSD was, or what its history, or how people use it, or there was nothing.
There wasn't very much.
And I think that's one of the beautiful things about...
Well, there were some.
There was shit books in the library at West Henderson High School talking about how your dad was a fucking lunatic. That's what I found.
But there were his books, which are good.
But you think they're going to put that? You think they're going to put
they weren't
the
in your library.
psychedelic experience in the library at West Henderson High School, home of the fucking Falcons?
North Carolina.
No, that's not going to be in the high school. And there's no internet. So it's like, at the time there was no internet. So my point is, I think one of the really cool things about using psychedelics as a practice or a method of healing is the research, the personal research that you can begin to do on whatever the particular medicine is that you're enjoying, and go and you should be doing this, and you should be looking at what is it, what's its history, what are other people saying that it does, what's it doing to me, obviously what are the dangers. And also, what the fuck am I supposed to do if somebody around me takes this and starts freaking out? Is there a specific way of working with that person, or not just freaking out? What I'm saying in particular with MDMA is a lot of the research that MAPS is going to find and has found, it's just good to educate yourself so the next time you're with someone who's taking MDMA, maybe you could be a little bit of a better listener, and maybe you can understand a little bit more of physiologically what's happening to them, and create a space of
to hold
healing.
Space, yeah.
Yeah.
And the other component of that, and MDMA and all the psychotropics, is am I of the right makeup to do this?
Yes.
And learning about yourself, and because not everybody is. You were talking about that earlier. If you're sort of prone to being bipolar, or even medically diagnosed, well, stay away.
Stay away.
Yeah.
Or at least do the research, because
know the data.
Know the data.
Yeah, and I never really used to kind of subscribe to this, but I do now. But the Tim Leary kind of driver's license idea about using psychedelics, and he said this when he was testifying in front of Congress in '66. That whole TED thing, says, "Well, I believe yes, there is a huge spike of illegitimate, irresponsible use of LSD and mescaline in today's society, and I believe everybody should be licensed." And you should look at your physical and emotional well-being, and you should be a card-carrying, right?
Oh, God, that's the best DMV on earth.
Yeah.
Whatever that fucking DMV looked like, I'd go there every day.
Right.
I'd be so excited about going to that DMV to take my psychedelic driving test to see if I'm okay, get my blood work done. And I've talked to someone at the last MAPS conference in Oakland who was telling me that they're actually exploring looking at the genome, being able to do DNA tests on people to tell them what psychedelics might work better with them. And also, outside of the dangerous aspect of it and knowing what can go wrong, I think another beautiful aspect of this research is that it is a big time guilt reducer, because if you've done your due diligence, if you've looked into the substance that you're taking, and you begin to realize this is actually a really useful, potentially healing, transformative substance, and I really don't need to feel like I'm some kind of drug-addled junkie underneath a bridge shooting black tar heroin into his arm when I'm taking this substance, because this substance is, who knows, it depends on what it may be, but you'll quickly discover pretty much everything is a hell of a lot less toxic than alcohol. So, and sometimes less toxic than coffee, certainly less toxic than cigarettes. And so then you begin to realize, like, wait a fucking minute. Like, this stuff relative to the socially accepted and embraced intoxicants, and I think calling alcohol and cigarettes an intoxicant, that is a correct term, because
Absolutely.
It's fucking toxic.
It's true.
Like, beginning to realize, like, wait a minute, I've been hoodwinked, haven't I? Because this substance that I'm taking, I know, at least based on all the research that's out there right now, what's going to happen. It's going to increase my body temperature. It might increase my heart rate a little bit. I shouldn't take it with alcohol, that's for sure. But, like, essentially my point is the cloud of state-induced paranoia and self-judgment that we're all afflicted by thanks to the war on drugs can lift a little bit from your experience of the psychedelic, which makes it that much more potent as a tool for personal transformation and healing.
And absolutely beautifully said. And the war on drugs is a whole other huge element to unpack with this. And hopefully, I see a lot of this research sort of exposing the, inherent hypocrisy and fallacy that is the war on drugs. There isn't a war on drugs. I mean, you talked about these intoxicants of alcohol and cigarettes and caffeine and things like this. And we see opioid deaths increasing almost exponentially every year, and with a huge percentage of them being from legal prescriptions.
Yeah.
So there isn't a war on drugs. There's a war on some drugs. There's a war on consciousness. There's a war on class.
Yeah.
Right. But there isn't a war on drugs.
What there is there's a hopefully diminishing group of people who are trying to, as much as possible, keep a door shut that they don't want us to walk through. And it's and every time you take a psychedelic, you crack the door a little bit, and you look out the door and you start realizing what kind of universe we're actually in. And for some reason, there's a lot of people like, don't shut the fucking door, shut the fucking door. It's like to get back to the concept of
shut the fucking door.
That's it.
Yes.
Yeah, and to get back to the concept of the merging and overcoming division as much as possible. Another way to put it would be, we're looking at a type of, I guess you could say, evolution that's happening to the optic nerve of the superorganism that represents every single person on Earth, which is that this ability to see the world around us is beginning to increase. Our ability, our lens is widening thanks to psychedelics, and we're beginning to see landscapes that seem to be half in and half out of this universe, and they seem to be half in and half out of us, and some of them are just pure subjective Rorschach style,
can't quite make sense of
brain splatter.
Yeah,
but there does appear to be, in certain psychedelics, reoccurring phenomena, shapes, contact with entities.
Yes, and like people who do DMT, it's very, very common for everyone to report the same style of sacred geometry.
That's right.
Yes.
And another for, even with like ketamine in the higher doses, there's reports of contact with extraterrestrials or being on the mothership. And with DMT too, many of us have seen something that appears to be an alien craft that we all seem to kind of be inside of right now, but kind of not be inside of, or maybe it's just merged with our planet, or maybe it's decided to park itself in this particular node of the time-space continuum, or maybe it's actually the psychedelics are its technology poking into this particular part of the multiverse. And
piercing of the veil.
Yeah.
That's what they are.
So however you want to put it, that's what we're seeing, though, is a repetition in experience that seems to not be subjective. It seems to be people are seeing something. We just aren't quite sure what it is. So that's, for some reason, they don't want us to see that thing.
Right. So the idea being that they needs to do this themselves.
This is okay. Yeah. So this is the old man. If we can give Donald Trump mushrooms, boy, everything would get better. And I think number one, I think he has taken psychedelics. I don't care what anyone says. I'm sure that guy has in some way tripped out on some shit.
Yeah.
2, I just don't think that that's really the answer. I don't think it's gonna.
I don't think it's that simple.
I just think it's a roll of the fucking dice. Like, think of some of your friends. I mean, I don't know if you have I could think of people who I've, seen at, like, let's say when I've gone to see the UFC, for example. Mm-hmm. There's certainly a lot of people who go to that are awesome. But I'm just saying that there's a few people who go to see people beat each other up.
Who aren't awesome.
Who are not what you would call savory.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily there because they respect the amazing sport that is.
They like violence.
Right.
Of course.
And so to look at those people and imagine, let's give this guy a bag of fucking mushrooms and he's going to be like, man, it's all about love. No way. That guy's just going to be swinging. It's just swinging at people. Possibly.
I mean, of course, there are exceptions. I mean, there are many people, who have turned on later in life who did a complete 180, midway through life. Yes, of course. And I don't think it's really that simple of just turning everyone on and watch Donald Trump is going to be a completely new human being tomorrow. I don't think that would happen if we gave... I don't think it would happen if we gave him MDMA today. It's an interesting thought, but I think it's more, it's juicier and has just a lot more meat and validity to think that the idea of turning more people on, it begins with our youth culture so we don't have to invent Donald Trumps in the first place.
Right.
I mean, that's what we're trying to get to, is not creating him in the first place. And not giving him the pedestal or the mouthpiece and the megaphone in the first place. I mean, there will always be shitty people in the world.
That's right.
Always. There's always light and dark, suffering, joy, sun, moon. There are always polluters. But the problem is not him. The problem is that there were so many people who believed him and supported him, and that's what we need to repair.
And again, with that stuff, I agree with you.
And I think psychedelics can help that. They won't create a soil that's fertile enough to let that kind of thing grow.
Yeah, I think you're right. And as far as those people go, and I know they're out there. I'm lucky because I have this really cool job. I get to interview people for my podcast, and the people who are around me are people like you. Mm. And so I'm certainly in a bubble of hyper coolness. Like, the people around me are true explorers. Like, and many of them are like, amazing fucking artists. And
you're blessed.
And I'm not saying that to like brag. I'm saying that because my experience of reality is based on this swirl of people around me who are so sweet and beautiful. I'm sorry if I don't mean to sound all puffed up. I feel so deeply grateful that I get to have this kind of life. So to answer your question, what I've come to from my own interaction with my community is that my focus cannot be on the people I see on CNN who are in wherever in middle America who are fucking pissed off, don't give a shit about Russian impacts or influences, don't give a fuck about anything. They think that like the news is lying to them. They think those people, it's so far away from me. So what I do, and sometimes I have asked people, and I'll ask you this, sometimes I ask people this on the podcast, I say, what part of you reminds you the most of Trump, Zach? Like, what part of you inside of you is Trump? And I think that's the idea, is to like I'll scan myself and be like, okay, there he is. Mm-hmm. Oh, there's the Trump living inside of me. Fucking narcissistic, you know what I mean? Self-absorbed, somebody who like wants to be
tendencies. I've got that. Yeah.
Someone who wants to be important.
Yeah.
Somebody who wants to be special. Somebody who wants to like lazily achieve. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like through some lazy, like
do it the easy way.
Weak thinking, produce some kind of like a delusional result that no one even believes anyway. So like that person, that's me. Like I can use Trump and see what parts of me are reflecting in him, and then be honest about that around my community and say, yeah, that's me, man. That's there, you know, and then by hitting that level of honesty and around a community, that then they act as a psychedelic medicine, because the community is a psychedelic, and then I can get healed from that. So I guess what I'm saying is very simply, the task at hand, because it feels like we need a task. What is the task? What do we do?
Well, I think that yeah, I mean, the matter at hand, the task is, as psychedelic citizens, as psychonauts living responsibly in the world, how can we lead by example? What's the best way to do it?
And the way to do that is to find your own boundaries in your life and see if you can dissolve them. You know, see if you can dissolve them. Where are you stuck? Can you dissolve this? Can you even go here? For me, we were just talking about it before we started recording. Again, I don't mean to go off the psychedelic chart here, but I think this does relate completely to psychedelics, because a lot of this stuff has been inspired for me by interactions with the psychedelic community. But for me, I've been a monogamous person for every single relationship I've ever been in, and it was been completely, in my mind, completely unacceptable that someone I was with could be with somebody else simultaneously in a serious way. That's like a hardcore, deep fucking wall that tortured me.
Challenged you.
Deeply.
Yes, right.
So jealousy, control, all this shit. Possession.
Yeah.
All of these things that when you are experiencing the epiphanies and revelations that come from a psychedelic experience seem absolutely abhorrent. You're like, what the fuck is wrong with me to think that I'm going to control someone, that I'm going to that I'm going to limit someone's experience, that I should be blowing the psychedelic bugle in the streets about the importance of exploring the outer terrain of our minds, while simultaneously telling a person I'm with to live in a very small cubbyhole, which is surrounded by
walls,
the wall
and
of
rules.
And rules.
Who are you to deny someone's fantasy?
Yes.
Why should you take that away? Because you got right.
Exactly.
Yeah, totally.
So you find those walls. For me, it was like that. That was a big one. And then you liberate yourself if you can. You dissolve those walls and you begin to realize, oh my God, that thing that I was desperately trying to avoid, it's like there was never anything to be afraid of. And then you're a little lighter. And then your community gets a little lighter too. Yeah. So I think it's like when a group, like the one of the tasks that we can do is follow the advice of Neem Karoli. Advice, I don't think it's the teachings of Neem Karoli Baba. We love everyone and tell the truth, and we work on ourselves so we can help the people closest to us. And then the next step of that for me has been building community, increasing the bonds with community.
That's that song. That's also
yes. And then we create bubbles now. Now what's happening is within this like world of Trump and the cyclone of like the news and the horror of the shootings and the impossible to understand sadness of the world and Syria and all that stuff, what ends up happening is even in the midst of that, these little bubbles of joy start forming.
Absolutely.
Because you are binding and bonding and giving and letting go with a community, and those people, any gain for a true community of the individual is a gain for the entire community. Anytime anybody has a real shift, anytime anyone lets go, anytime anyone's brave enough to like walk outside of the trap of their identity and move towards love, the whole community gets that much stronger. And that, to me, we create these little engines of love in our personal communities, and we fan those flames, and that will create, I think, the great change that we all feel is happening anyway.
That's amazing. So in kind of wrapping it up a little bit, I did want to, you said several things throughout our talk here about your relationship with your psychedelic epiphanies and how you apply them and see the world. So you're in your 40s now. You've been doing psychedelics a while. You started when you were a teenager?
Yes.
Pretty much. Tell me a little bit about your evolution of psychedelic awareness. I mean, I started psychedelics when I was 14. I now will say, I mean, I don't regret a thing. I wouldn't change a thing, but I probably did them too young, I'd say. You know, I mean, I wouldn't, you know, I was at Grateful Dead concert seeing Jerry Garcia, so it was amazing. Yeah. But I would say it's, you know, I wouldn't tell a 14-year-old kid today, you know, to do it. But, you know, my relationship, wow, it's changed so much.
Well, imagine if somebody told 14-year-old you not to do it.
Yeah, well, they did. My dad did.
Yeah.
My dad did.
Your dad told you, you're like, okay, Dad.
Yeah, he's like, you're too young. Trust me. One day you'll understand. Your brain isn't fully developed yet. Just wait. I'm probably not going to stop you, but...
Here, okay, so this is some real, like, delicate ground here, because to, like, say, you know, anything around it, you could accidentally get caught in the trap of sounding like you're trying to encourage kids to get high. Right. And like and all I know is when I was 15 and I found out, I knew about LSD, but when I finally made contact with the substance, it was one of the most powerful, liberating, beautiful, healing, incredible experiences of my life.
And you knew that then?
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. The problem is it created a difficulty for me, because my dad wasn't Tim Leary. My dad, you know what I mean? I didn't have a person that I could go to and say, "Hey, Mom, what would you call the calligraphy that seems to represent every language that sometimes I see in the ceiling of my friend's Hyundai?" What is that? Do you know what that is? That thing?
What is that? I still want to know what that is, by the way.
Well, I mean, we have a lot of different theories, but like, you know, sometimes I like to think that what we're looking at there is the and actually someone said this to me. Someone said, you know, in the book of John, it says, "In the beginning was the Word." And sometimes I like to think that that's what you're seeing is the font of God written in all things. But that being said, I didn't have someone to go to be like, "Oh, well, what you're seeing there is the font of God, Duncan." Times New Roman. But like, no, you don't. But to be liberated from the oppressive paradigm of life growing up in North Carolina and getting like the state jizzing all over your face every time you go to school, and they tell you some weird version of history and some idea of what's right and what's wrong, and suddenly to have this beautiful temporary vacation from that sadness and that bleak future, I would, if I wouldn't change a fucking thing, except I would reduce. I would like, if I could change anything, it would be to not feel guilty about it, and that's all. So I wholeheartedly reject the concept of the state modulating the consciousness of the people, and I think that because of the war on drugs, we don't know what age people should be doing anything. I mean, are we going to like look at indigenous cultures that give psychedelics to kids when they're 12 or 13? Are we going to judge them and say their brains aren't developed enough?
Completely different map.
It's a completely different map, and it's and you know, we're just figuring out how to use these technologies. So my romance with psychedelics throughout my life has gone through different phases, and particularly one phase was the phase where I was still grappling with my fear of death. So those trips are not fun trips, and so I went through a series, many hours of death trips, many hours of resisting my own mortality, many fucked up trips of anxiety and paranoia and freakouts that all had their root in the fact that I was still terrified to let go of my body and to accept the fact that I was going to die. But since that's gone away from me, thank God, the new phase, I guess that you could call it, is that now the experiences just seem to be really beautiful and transcendent and filled with like joy, and if there is fear that shows up, it's the kind of fear you look forward to because it's showing you a place you didn't know you were stuck. So you're like, okay, cool. Oh shit, look at that. Whoa, no, fuck that. I couldn't deal with that. But you know that now. You know, because now the thing I know, I mean, the vision, I mean, we've heard different stories of this, but the story of Jesus and the rich man is one of my favorite in the Bible, because this rich dude comes up. He wants to follow the fucking Son of God, Christ, the Christ. He's getting the chance. He is in an incarnation where he gets to be face to face with a being at that level.
Right.
And he says, I want to follow you. I love you. And the being says, oh, no problem. All you have to do is just give all your stuff to the poor and then come with me. And the rich man is like, I can't do that. And that's that Meatloaf song. I would do anything for love, but I won't do that. And it's like, and so that's like, at first when you're taking psychedelics and the psychedelic comes asking for something from you, at the very least an acknowledgement of a thing you've been ignoring, then you will be like, fuck that, no way, man, I'm not looking at that, I'm not doing that, I couldn't do that. And you freak out, and that's one way to have a really fantastically bad trip.
Yeah.
But then what ends up happening is you begin to, like, when the psychedelic comes and asks for one more thing, or when life comes and asks for one more thing, you begin to realize, like, and it's always the same. You're always like, no, not that. Not that. Not that. And every time you're like,
I'm not ready to do that.
You're right.
Yes.
Every time you're like, okay,
right.
Here you go. You can have that too.
Yeah.
You can have that too. Then immediately what you get back is 1,000,000 times more than you ever conceptualized you could have. And so, but to get to that point, you've got to go through a lot of, I think, what the people at MAPS call challenging trips. So that's been my evolution in psychedelics.
And I suspect, and I hear you and feel you being here in the room with you, that you have, I guess, your own personal internal ecosystem has been affected by your relationship with sort of the Ram Dass zeitgeist.
Oh, yeah.
A little bit. Yes. I mean,
not a little bit.
I mean, completely.
Yeah, completely shifted because of that satsang. But also from the psychedelic satsang too. And I mean, they're the same satsang.
Well, they are a little bit.
They could be.
They could be. And one thing that RD does talk about a little bit in some of his older lectures, but not enough about how the psychedelic experience was different after Neem Karoli Baba.
Wow.
That I love. And so many of the Maharaji satsang doesn't like to talk about that.
Yeah.
No, you don't need psychedelics anymore.
Yeah.
You already have it. RD did not stop tripping.
I know.
That is a great urban legend.
I know.
And the relationship with, like you were saying about especially with the challenging trips, and oh fuck, I'm not ready to let go of that.
Yeah.
You hear RD talk about that all the time. Going to the porn theater and just like, oh my god, I'm just not right. You
got it. And as they say, as it was in the beginning, so shall it be in the end. And
yes.
And similarly, for me, when my first acid trip was so glorious. And because you're in high school, what are you worried about? You're not making a mortgage payment. You're not worried about taxes. You're not, you know what I mean? What are you worried about? You're not worried.
Yes.
You're not you don't have all the baggage of a life. And so it's just like, wow. And it's amazing. But then once you start getting into the, adult world and you become attached to whatever the thing is you're going to become attached to, then your trips are going to become more challenging. And this is where people are like, I just can't do that. Like some people are like, I could not take a psychedelic because I cannot deal with what it's going to show me. And it's like, really? Well, what's it going to show you? Because it seems like you already know, and they do know, and that's what's hilarious is it's like, listen, I've invested a lot of time in avoiding this particular problem that's deep inside of me. So anyway, my point is, what I have noticed is thanks to the Ram Dass people and a very, very, very slow, grudging movement for me spiritually in the sense that they keep telling me something that I should do. And only until recently I was like, but you don't really mean it. You don't really mean I should meditate every day. Like, you know what I mean? That's one thing they always say is like, just have a daily practice. And I'd always be like, no, you don't really mean a daily practice. Yeah, but anyway, my point is, and I'll stop this ramble. What I'm saying is the two pair very nicely. And that,
I think so too.
And it's wonderful to have that lens, the Ram Dass lens, to help integrate the data sets that you get when you enter into the psychedelic universe.
Duncan, thank you.
Thank you, Zach.
Good to see you, man.
Good to see you.
Welcome to the end of the podcast. You've made it this far, and we haven't done this in a while, but this is the end of the podcast book giveaway. We're going to give away 2 copies of the Timothy Leary Project Inside the Great Counterculture Experiment, courtesy of Abrams Books. So what you have to do to win a copy, one of 2, is send an email to info@itsallhappeningshow.com, and then I take all of the email addresses and put them into a random number selector, and that's how a winner is picked. So send your email to info@itsallhappeningshow and get your copy today.